Today we'll be a revisiting of this lens here. This is a Canon 85mm f1.2 RF lens for the EOS R mount. And previously I reviewed this lens using the EOS R, and today I'll be looking at it from the viewpoint of using the EOS R5. I'm Richard and welcome to ZP Productions, and today will be the first of the many revisiting videos I'll be doing for the RF lens. And the reason is really simple. The R5 is a significantly better camera. It has IBIS, it is way better in autofocus, and it has more megapixels, which matters to lenses that are really sharp, right? Now, the RF 85mm f1.2 lens is the first lens I'm going to revisit because then with the EOS R, I felt that firstly, this lens is not challenged by the 30 megapixels. 30 megapixels seems to be so sharp that I felt that, there is still a lot more room to wiggle. So the R5 now has 45 megapixels, and we'll take a look at it in the image quality section. Next is that the 85mm f1.2 here, it is a 1.2 lens, so depth of field is really low. Now, the EOS R is a very accurate camera, no doubt about that. But the eye detection wasn't that superb. And if you ask me, the autofocus when it comes to, sudden motions and movements were not really accurate enough for a 1.2 lens. The depth of field is really shallow on this lens here. And any minor movement will move the AF off the target itself. And the 85mm f1.2 will definitely benefit if the autofocus is better. And lastly, the EOS R has no IS, this lens has no IS, and today there is now IBIS in the R5. So now let's take a look at how it actually performs IBIS with this lens here. So this review video will be split into 3 parts. We'll talk about image stabilization, followed by autofocus, and then image quality. Then I will close off this entire video with some thoughts and of course some of my works I've done with this lens itself. Now, this is not a full review video. If you want to look at a review of this lens, take a look at the link up there. It will cover most of the basics of the lens, such as the speed of the autofocus, because that is not determined so much by the body. The speed is determined by the motor and the amount of lens you move inside. And of course, the things like build quality, weather sealing, I will all cover that in the original review video here. Or should I say, original review video in the link above. So today we'll be covering things that the R5 improved on. First, let's talk about image stabilization, and straight away, I'll show you this image here. This is shot with the 85mm f1.2 RF with the EOS R5 at 1/10 of a shutter, which is 3 stops below the recommended focal range of this lens, which is usually 85mm will require a 1:100 shutter. This is 1/10, so it's slightly more than 3 stops. Now, in real world, really, if you are shooting with an 85mm lens and you want tech sharp shots, you'll probably need like 1:200 shutter, because anything below 100, you will get slightly soft shots here and there, and you actually miss quite a bit of shots. So with image stabilization now at 1/10 of a shutter, you get 60% usable shots, and out of these 60%, 3 of them, which is 30% of all the shots here, tech sharp. So how to read this is 5 star is tech sharp, 4 star is usable, 3 stars means probably usable if you sharpen it a bit, and 2 and 1 stars are unusable. That is at least for my basis of ranking the photos here. And the fact that you can do the shot at 1/10 of a shutter and attain 60% usable shots is really impressive. Now, 1/10 plus f1.2 literally means that you can almost shoot in almost any condition in the real world and still use a really low ISO, which is really useful. Now, for the purpose of portraiture, by the way, I shoot a lot of portraits. For the purpose of portraiture, especially like this shot here, I have tested many shutter speed, and I can tell you that 120, 125, 130 is probably the best shutter speed you can use. Anything below 120 is unusable because the model will fidget and move and then spin around. It's really hard to get a tech sharp shot. At 125 or 130 or 140, normally that will compensate enough for general small wiggle in the model movement. So, even though this lens can go to 1/10 and get 60% sharp shots, if you are shooting a real model, considering that the subject does wiggle and move around, you probably need 120 or 130 or even 140 shutter to obtain a really sharp shot for the purpose of portraiture. Now, that is for image stabilization. So we'll move on to the next part, which is autofocus. Now, for autofocus itself, the R5 is a marked improvement over the EOS R. So how does it change the autofocus of this lens here? Now, as I said earlier, the autofocus speed is determined by the motor in the lens. So from close to far, it's not going to get a lot quicker. But what it gets quicker is in terms of, the sudden movement, the sudden reactions, and that is all determined by the camera itself. And I can tell you that, no, with the R5, any sudden movement or sudden reaction or spinning shots are a lot easier. I have done portraiture where the model spins. With the old EOS R, there is a good chance to miss, because by the time the EOS R can capture the eye and lock onto the face and the eye itself, the f1.2 depth of field is so shallow that the camera is not moving the lens fast enough, and you'll probably not get a sharp shot. Most likely you'll get focus on the hair or focus on the ear, anywhere but the eye itself. f1.2 is really, really shallow. But on the R5, you can actually use 85mm at f1.2, which is an ultra thin depth of field. And when the model turns towards the camera, the moment the R5 picks out the eye, you are almost guaranteed a sharp shot. I would say, as out of 100%, or from my experience, out of maybe like say 20 or 30 shots, I think I only miss like 2 or 3 shots in such situation, and that is very impressive. The R5 reaction speed is so fast that it can shift the 85mm f1.2 fast enough so that the f1.2 aperture could be used for moving shots itself. Really, really impressive. And it also carries on to the next thing regarding autofocus accuracy. The R5 autofocus is so accurate that more often than not, if you are using eye detection or you are using single point autofocus, if you put it on the iris, it will focus on the iris. You won't have the problem where, you focus slightly behind the iris or slightly in front of the iris, resulting things like sharper ear or sharper eyelashes. f1.2 is really, really shallow. As I want to emphasize again, it is really shallow. And having an extremely accurate autofocus system really helps you, especially doing portraiture, because you really want the iris to be tack sharp. And the R5 autofocus system really breathes new life into this lens here, because f1.2 is something that really requires a really good autofocus system to capture moving shots and to capture shots with high accuracy on the iris itself. The R5 and the 85mm f1.2 RF is a fantastic combination when it comes to autofocus. And that's about it for autofocus. I'll move on to the next section, which is image quality. Now, when it comes to image quality, I usually do 2 types of tests. Firstly, is a synthetic test, and then next I will talk about tests, utilizing real world photos themselves. Now, regarding real world photos, I do a lot of portraiture. I'm mainly a portrait photographer, so I will go from that aspect when it comes to portraiture itself. But when it comes to synthetic tests, let's take a look at the usual shots that I do. One is daylight on the buildings and one is nighttime on the same area again. Now, when it comes to daylight on the building at f1.2, it is sharp everywhere in the frame. Now, there is some slight hazing because the target is a bit far away, but you notice that the building is sharp, and even the corners, all the blocks, or should I say all the containers, are also sharp. And if you ask me, the 45 megapixel sensor still doesn't seem to be challenging the lens too much when it comes to optical quality or sharpness at the pixel level. That is about it for sharpness. You can see the center is sharp and the edge is sharp. What else can you want? 45 megapixel on a full frame lens at f1.2 still gives you that kind of result. It's really impressive. Now, the next thing I will look at is a night shot, which is more on the chromatic aberrations, because the glowing ball of lights will result in things like blooming, chromatic aberration, coma, all those bad aberrations you can get on the lens optics when it comes to shining bright lights. And you can see there is firstly no chromatic aberration. All the balls of light are perfectly single color, no funny rims, and also there is no much bloom or glow in those bulbs themselves. So you don't get funny hazing around the bulbs itself, which is really good output from the 85mm here. And just a note, 45 megapixel sensor usually will exaggerate those problems compared to a 30 megapixel EOS R sensor. But even on the R5, I don't see any form of CA, considering that it is 50% more pixels, I still don't see CA. I think it's as good as it gets. And if you look around the frame, I don't notice any weird balls of light. I mean, there is the usual oval-shaped balls, cat eyeballs at the corner, but if not, I don't see really much unusual balls of light in the frame itself. Very good performance, considering that the R5 is 45 megapixel and it exaggerates any bad points of the lens itself. Now, there is so much for synthetic tests. Now, in real world tests, I have done many portrait shoots with it. I can tell you in terms of sharpness, you can easily get the iris to be sharp. You can get every single lash on the face to be sharp. Now, just to note that I'm not allowed to show a lot of the subject photos without editing. If not, they will come and knock on my door and give me really they will show me their unhappiness. So a lot of these shots, of course, are processed, but when it comes to sharpness in the eye, normally they are not processed. And you can see every single shot here is really sharp, tech sharp on the eye itself. In real world, I would say as this RF 85mm f1.2 with the R5, as long as the subject is not covering the eye or doing some really weird movement, 98% sharp shots is easily obtainable. And I mean sharp shots is sharp on the iris itself, not sharp on the nose, not sharp on the ear, sharp on the iris. And it is a very impressive result considering this is an 85mm f1.2 with a razor thin depth of field. Really cannot be done in yesteryears. I mean, if you have tried using the EF 85mm f1.2 and try to get any tech sharp shot on the old EF cameras, I'm saying that it is going to be a huge challenge. And the R5 could do it really easily with the RF 85mm f1.2, even on a moving subject itself. I think this is as good as it gets in today's technology itself. Overall, if you own the R5 and you want the best portrait lens in the world, get the 85mm RF, either the RF 85mm or the RF 85mm DS. It's a personal opinion on which is better. Either one would perform fantastically on the R5 itself. And if you compare the 85mm 1.2 versus like the old 85mm EF and of course the Sigma 85mm or maybe any other 85mm out there, I would say the RF 85mm has the best optics. It costs the most. And in the past, when you are using the EOS R, you may be considering the EF version because the EF version comes with IS. Now that the R5 has inbuilt image stabilization, the 85mm f1.2 here is now a sharper lens, and it also has image stabilization and will perform way better than the EF 85mm f1.4. When it comes to sharpness, when it comes to aberration, it is a better lens all around. The only downside of the 85mm f1.2 you can see here is the weight and the size. And I will not talk about it too much because I already talked about it in the previous video. But really, it's just the weight and the size and the price itself. So if you own the R5, probably, you probably should have some funds left for good lenses. And if you are a portrait photographer, you want the best portrait lens at a short tele range. Let's not talk about the full tele range of 200mm or 300mm, but short tele range portrait lens, the 85mm f1.2 should be the lens of your choice because I have tried EF mount lenses. Yes, they perform really good, better than their native EF mount camera, but definitely the RF mount lenses are still better when it comes to image stabilization, when it comes to autofocus, and when it comes to optics, the 85mm f1.2 I think is number one in the RF EF mount era of short telephoto portrait lens. And that's about it for today. If you're owning the R5, I totally recommend you to get this. If not, it really depends on whether you want it or not. Until then, I will see you in my next video, and I will look at more of the old RF lenses and how it performs on the R5. Until then, I will see you again. Bye bye.